This insightful thought leadership event features Dr. Selda Dagistanli, who will delve into her research on cultures of abuse and the racialisation of gendered violence. Dr. Dagistanli critically examines how minorities are marginalised in legal, institutional and community contexts, focusing on the intersectional suffering of women of colour. Their work highlights the compounded racial and epistemic injuries these women endure through inadequate institutional responses. From diaspora communities in Australia to war zones abroad, Dr. Dagistanli traces the common thread of insult and injury, advocating for a shift from white benevolence to truly listening and foregrounding the voices of women in these cultural communities. Welcome to Dr. Dagistanli's presentation on community-based research, exploring strategies to address gendered, racial and epistemic violence against migrant women of colour.
I'd also like to acknowledge the campuses of Western Sydney, stand on the lands of the Darug, Darawal and Wiradjuri peoples. We thank them for their support of our work in their lands in Greater Western Sydney and beyond. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. They are the original and ongoing owners, and I'd like to welcome any First Nations people that are here with us today. If you have joined us, I am honoured that you are here to listen to my presentation. My acknowledgement of the lands on which I give this paper also extends to an acknowledgement of centuries of colonial violence visited on First Nations people in Australia and around the world. The violence that was visited on men, but in particular ways against women who were considered less than human and whose proud cultures and identities as First Nations women were erased, smothered and repressed, literally and epistemically in the history of nations, formed upon the suffering of the original owners. I'd like to thank you all for coming on this journey with me. It is deeply personal. I dedicate this paper to my migrant mother, who my sister, brother and I lost to illness late last year, and to all of the migrant women we knew growing up who had nowhere to turn when things got really bad for them. I'm sorry. I didn't think I'd cry over that one. And to all the Palestinian sisters, mothers, daughters who have lost their lives in a brutal massacre sanctioned by the global north. Palestinian women continue to visibly suffer the unspoken and unspeakable violence enacted by colonial powers, as do all First Nations women, whether invisible or invisible ways. Silence still shrouds that violence, while those Palestinian families who have made it here intact remain helpless while being handed empty platitudes of well-being by institutions through individualised and culturally inadequate counselling services. I see you, I hear you, and I acknowledge your suffering. Oh, sorry, I didn't expect that to happen. And before I move on, I do want to be clear that this paper is about all women who experience domestic and family violence, but there are specificities of the migrant experience and responses to it that need particular consideration that I will focus on today. And the conversation is not intended to be comfortable. So the focus of this paper. For the purposes of this paper, I talk about violence against women in the form of domestic, family and intimate partner violence. But I also mean institutional violence against migrant women of colour in the form of institutional racism and the attendant injustices of silencing or not hearing, testimonial incompetence, or rendering the testimonies given of women unintelligible, and ontological exclusion and erasure. These are concepts that I will come to later. This paper doesn't focus on the prevalence and occurrence of gender violence in specific communities. That's actually not in question. Gender violence is prevalent everywhere, and unfortunately no culture on this earth is immune, whether ethnic, racial or institutional. Of course, some cultures are worse than others. We have to acknowledge that. And there is a spike sometimes in DV, domestic violence, family violence and intimate partner violence in diaspora communities for varied structural reasons. Also, my focus in this paper is not on migrants from European, predominantly Christian, white, liberal, democratic nations. I'm talking about migrants of colour, migrants from the global south, perhaps non-Christian and or non-democratic or from non-liberal societies as opposed to illiberal societies, which is an important distinction that Iku Perek makes. Not cold communities. Cold, incidentally, I feel is an acronym that I feel sanitizes and erases the differential realities of migrant diaspora experience, but racially marginalised diaspora communities. So just want to clarify all of that before I move on. And the backdrop of what I will talk about underscores a thorny problem that I have grappled for my entire career. How do we talk about a specific kind of gender violence in some racialised diaspora communities? How do we talk about it without racialising the violence itself as some essential barbaric practice of those cultures? How do we talk about this specific kind of violence without compounding the broader racial and structural problems already felt by those communities, the exclusion and social isolation they may feel already, the cultural, ontological erasure felt by some women when culturally unsafe or inappropriate standards are applied. In other words, how do we talk about violence in racialised cultural communities without adding insult to injury? So the insult, let me address that first. The insult is partly a racialisation of violence. This comes with the positioning of migrant women subjects in a country that proves itself time and again to reproduce its colonialist foundations due to its institutional centering of whiteness. In such an imaginary, race and violence that is culturally produced and reproduced are issues that only others endure, and the white institutional frameworks can help with. Hence, whiteness is a foundation that is interrogated in this paper and as something that reproduces violence because it continues to remain uninterrogated in our efforts to address inequality. Speaking from a Canadian cultural context, the editors of the volume White Benevolence situate whiteness across three specific domains. They say first a location of structural advantage of race privilege, including a range of unearned advantages such as high wages, access to quality healthcare, access to education, and protection from the justice and legal system. Second, whiteness is a standpoint or a place from which to look at oneself, others and society, or internalized dominance. Third, a set of cultural practices often not named as white by white people, but considered instead as Canadian or normal, and insert any country in that is a colonised nation. The authors then go on to assert that just as white settlers feel unquestioningly entitled to the resources of the nation, such assumptions are also found in the conviction that society needs everything that whiteness has to offer. And this is where the insult comes in if migrant women of colour seek support for violence. The insult is an abject failure to understand that many migrant women have specific and complex cultural, familial and community bonds that are often understood poorly, if understood at all, by support services. This brings me to the idea of injury, which adds to the insult of racialisation and a failure to understand cultural specificity. It's not just a play on words about the injuries sustained in the violence or whatever, violence enacted, but the ontological injury, the injury that's to our very being, that comes from the injustice of not being heard in the ways that migrant women need to be heard. I will conceptualise this all through interrelated concepts of epistemic violence, ontological exclusion and erasure. These injustices inhere in practices that range from silencing through to a lack of receptivity and cultural acknowledgement, which I will argue is inherent to systems of individualistic white benevolence. Empirically, I will draw on two examples. The first is an African Great Lakes community-led project initiated by the Great Lakes Agency for Peace and Development, GLAPID for short, with the assistance of the Sexualities and Gender Research Group, SAGA, at Western Sydney University. The project examined understandings of domestic violence against Great Lake community members and documented the experiences and views of health and welfare workers delivering services to the Great Lakes communities. By way of background, the countries that make up the Great Lakes region are Rwanda, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and Burundi. As such, migrants from African Great Lakes regions are from diverse backgrounds with different languages, cultures and norms. And in that research, domestic and family violence, particularly violence against women, was identified as a significant issue for the Great Lakes communities of Western Sydney due to impacts of trauma from their homelands, due to intense conflict there. Migration and resettlement, which is actually a trauma that I will address later in this presentation as well, which all can increase conflict and violence in intimate relationships. It was found that members affected by family and domestic violence face a number of obstacles to accessing appropriate services, including cultural, structural and language barriers. So tracing back to factors emerging from the regions from which African Great Lakes migrants emigrated, gender violence, or more specifically violence against women, was strongly shaped, I need to say, by the impacts of colonialism. Colonialism brought about the disjuncture between collective obligation and colonial imposition of individual rights, the imposition of Western gender categories and systems, and an associated gendered separation of the public and private sphere. Militarism and gender oppression, which all operate to reinforce one another. This created societies where men dominate the household, and as well as the political and economic arenas, and so power over women became legitimised and normalised. There were some cultural factors in that research that emerged, cultural practices which may increase the potential for abuse, such as bride price dowry, political violence, the experiences of war and conflict, which leads to PTSD and is associated with family violence, and intergenerational violence. My focus in this paper are the findings that indicated barriers to seeking support for women that had been subject to family, domestic or intimate partner violence. There were interrelated language, structural and cultural barriers, including cultural dissonance and displacement during migration, a disconnect between understandings of individual and collective responsibility, the support of women experiencing violence, like, families, for example, trust, cultural codes of shame and respect. And I'm not going to address all of those separately, but we will come back to those when I speak of epistemic violence. Second example I will refer to from a very different community, but there are similarities, is Amani Haydar's memoir, The Mother Wound, and she documents very bravely, and it is a heart-wrenching memoir to read, the experience of a Lebanese Muslim woman, the impact of domestic violence, intergenerational trauma, her identity, motherhood and grief. Her mother was murdered by her father, and Haydar reflects on her upbringing in a Lebanese Australian Muslim family, the societal silences surrounding them, the abuse, and the emotional legacy of her grandmother's experiences in war-torn Lebanon. Haydar confronts the cultural and personal expectations placed on women and bravely uses her story to break cycles of violence and silence. Although she also is met, I'm going to talk about this today, with epistemic violence and ontological erasure. Before I turn to these concepts, it's imperative to position myself in a paper such as this one. So who am I to be talking about this? What is my positionality? I'm going to try not to cry on this one as well. This is uncomfortable. Okay, so I don't necessarily like sharing this, but this presentation has to be uncomfortable. So, and, you know, I take that from my wonderful colleague, Shima, herself an Iranian migrant woman. Shima, I know you're online. Hi. Discomfort is needed in such conversations, Shima tells me. I'm a second generation migrant. My parents immigrated here from Turkey in 1970 when the doors were opened by the Whitlam government to non-European, non-white nations. They brought two little kids with them and they had a rough run. It's a common story. They didn't speak the language. Any skills they developed over there were not recognised here. Their jobs, when they secured them, were unskilled and poorly paid. When my mother gained qualifications attending TAFE at night, she was doubted about her abilities. But she pushed through to work in a government job where she was eventually told she was incompetent after sustaining a physical injury and subjected to epistemic violence. We were working class. I was born here. Growing up in 1980s Australia and going to university in the mid-90s, I was consistently reminded that I was not really white. Being Muslim background but non-practicing, I was really ambiguous, racially ambiguous, indeterminate identity. I looked white, but my name gave things away. I have educational capital, but I will say that it took me a long time to find my voice. I guess I could be considered as having lived experience as a second generation migrant. Am I a woman of colour? White? It depends on who you ask. It depends on your positionality. Um, it isn't entirely clear where I could be placed institutionally, if anywhere at all. Many women from the general vicinity of the Middle East, as not European, not First Nations, Asian, Latina, African, have a similar experience. They fall into the overlooked middle while experiencing some sort of racialization. Layla Lalami, a non-hijabi Muslim woman from Morocco who has immigrated to the USA, articulates this beautifully in her book, Conditional Citizenship, where she describes what life was like after the September 11 attacks in the USA, even though she was racially ambiguous. And she talks about how her whole life is lived in between. The space I occupy is an intersection of identities, whose lives are grey, mine certainly, but when a violence erupts, whether as a result of terrorist attack or military invasion, battle lines are swiftly drawn and grey lives become targets. What's particularly relevant to this conversation of the women in our community, to this conversation, is that the women in our community growing up had stories of family troubles, coercive control, domestic violence. They suffered in silence because they didn't know where to turn, who to tell, and how to tell their stories. My mother's response to that when I asked was, we can't air our dirty laundry. They wouldn't understand anyway. And if I said that in Turkish, it would be more colourful. um, of course, this stance is not just one upheld by migrant women of colour. White women too uphold codes of propriety. But there is an additional layer of shame, mistrust and silence for migrant women. And these surface from internalized cultural codes and are compounded by the racist exclusions to which they've already been subjected in the institutions of white settler societies. Aside from the fact that we are all settlers in First Nations land, migrant women are grappling still in gendered ways with the pain of separation from their families, homelands, and as Abdelmayek Sayed puts it, the unshakable guilt of their absence from homeland and family. That endures no matter how long you've been separated from your country. But then, as Sayed poignantly says, Immigrants are also absent in the country of arrival when they become victims of exclusion, and are seen only as a workforce which provides value to that country, the host country. They don't get a job, then the disempowerment deepens. So in our African Great Lakes community research, for example, participants expressed the absences they felt by leaving home and immigrating to Australia. The cultural displacement and dissonance is gendered and felt by men and women differently. One of the men's focus groups painted this gendered picture of disempowerment in immigrating. He can barely speak English and he has no job. The psychological effect on him already, he's already feeling he's not a man enough to provide. Meanwhile, women immigrants in the African Great Lakes diaspora communities adjusted better to social norms, but became more vulnerable in their marital relationships because they lost the primary support networks of their extended families with whom they had strong gendered ties. And there are some wonderful traditions that we uncovered. Kua I can't remember the name. I don't want to mangle it, but I will come back to it if I can, if I don't run out of time. But basically, this hints at the sanctity of family in the lives of migrant women. They provide support and are supported by families in the absence of support from partners or anyone else. Once those families and communities are left behind, there is the suffering of isolation in a framework of exclusion that affects migrant women differently. My mother's experience of arriving to Australia resonated with the stories shared by women in the African Great Lakes communities. Crying in the office of a kindly old GP, my mother repeatedly said, "I'm sorry," because she didn't have the language to express the anguish she felt about leaving home and family and arriving to what felt like utter isolation in an inhospitable place. So, migrant women of colour, where do they fit in feminism and gender equity? Especially those that are experiencing varying degrees of marginalisation. They feel they're in Australia, but they don't feel they're of Australia. Within this context, gender equity and feminism from a white institutional viewpoint does not and cannot speak to all women in the same way, even with the best possible intentions. As wonderful First Nations scholar Eileen Morton Robinson says, feminism must accept that it is not the political home for women all the time, and that this white race privilege remains undisclosed, unmarked and invisible to those who possess it. Amani Haydar says something similar. The more I learned, the more I felt like I'd missed an important conversation. Still, I wasn't sure what contemporary feminism could do for me. When Clementine Ford's hashtag Questions for Men went viral, I chatted to my work friends about her work with a mix of admiration and skepticism. Where did our lives fit within these questions? And to what extent could we benefit from these conversations? How were women like us meant to get on board when mainstream feminism had often silenced us? My friends and I had never been given permission to sound angry, and radical feminism, we weren't allowed to be radical. We were the subjects of de-radicalisation. So I won't read the rest of my quote Amani's quote there, but she did not have the luxury to speak or sound angry. She did not have that luxury because of the pervasive racialisation that goes on around Muslim women and Arab women. I also want to say something in a paper on epistemic violence about the politics of lived experience. Haydar, Lalami, the African Great Lakes participants talk about their lived experiences in poignant narratives. In a paper on epistemic violence, I need to talk about this as well. It is invaluable. Lived experience is invaluable. It situates and respects someone as a knower. It centres those voices. and it can illuminate different standpoints and serve as a check on dominant policies and practices. But it is not the one and only way to enact social change. There are some caveats. It relies first and foremost on an unattainable idea of authentic identity that is natural and unchanging. Identities are adopted by the self, but they're also ascribed by other people on us. And not all identity or all people who identify with a particular group are subject to the same experiences. These experiences are strongly mediated by intersections of gender, class, faith, age, sexuality, disability, and so forth. So obviously the category of migrant women is not a monolith, neither is the same nationality, community, faith, culture and colour of migrants. Disparities are as large in the same migrant communities as they are between migrant communities. And within those specific migrant communities, as in all communities, there are all sorts of issues around classism, religious or sectarian divisions, homophobia, ableism, where we see some migrants more marginalised than others. Also, if we rely on lived experience alone, we are expecting the people that are marginalised and have suffered those experiences to do all the social justice work. The burdens, the emotional burdens fall on them. This is all to say that lived experience is really important. It is indispensable to finding such just solutions to an array of social justices, but it shouldn't be the only way. It's an integral part of the way, but everyone has to be involved. Social justice is everyone's responsibility. What does need to happen, though, is that the testimony of groups that are marginalised, decentered, silenced should be heard properly as a core part of the solution in intersectional anti-racist praxis. So I turn now to the concepts that I'm going to talk about in my paper. These are interrelated concepts of epistemic violence and ontological erasure and exclusion. These are interrelated themes that emerged across my research with DV in African Great Lakes diaspora communities and Amani Haydar's memoir. And these examples, where appropriate, will be peppered with my own observations autoethnographically. So, epistemic violence. Christy Dodson's seminal work on epistemic violence talks not just about literal violence that accompanies colonialism, but the suppression and disappearing of local knowledges or Indigenous or provincial knowledges in the quest to privilege Western-centric knowledge. Oppressed or marginalised groups can be silenced because of their group membership, and silencing here does not necessarily point to literal silencing, but rather an inability to be heard. So Dodson highlights the core condition for communication as the reciprocity of speaking and hearing. She says successful communication is an audience willing and capable of hearing us. The extent to which an entire population of people can be denied this kind of linguistic reciprocation as a matter of course institutes epistemic violence. So whether this is intentional or unintentional, Dodson continues, epistemic violence is instituted in an audience's refusal to communicatively reciprocate a linguistic exchange. It is a failed exchange due to pernicious or malign ignorance. The failure to hear causes harm in certain contexts through constituting a silencing and an invalidation of testimony. Dodson also distinguishes between an isolated instance and a practice overall of silencing. There's repeated reliably locating epistemic violence and attendant harms in the practice rather than an isolated incident, even though isolated incidents can also be harmful. Moving on to how epistemic violence is enacted, Dodson points to testimonial quieting and testimonial smothering. Testimonial quieting pertains to situations in which stereotypical images control the narrative and social images of marginalised groups. These tropes then create a situation where audiences don't recognise a speaker from the group as a knower or a credible source. This results in the failure of one's words to gain uptake. And this can happen to women of all backgrounds, but it's more likely to affect racially marginalised migrant women who might, but are less likely to have the capital to fight a system in a country which more than likely excludes them. Testimonial smothering takes this a little bit further. Adding to the failure to recognise someone as a knower, testimonial smothering coerces silence from the speaker in an act of self-censorship. Dotson describes this as a situation where a speaker capitulates to the pressure to not introduce unsafe or risky testimony. She gives some of the following examples. Kimberl Crenshaw highlights what has been historically seen as unsafe, risky testimony in some non-white communities, which when she points to women of colour silence around occurrences of domestic violence. Domestic violence within, for example, African American communities is often shrouded in silence given the possibility that the testimony about domestic violence can be understood to corroborate stereotypes concerning the imagined violent black male. And both forms of epistemic violence are visible in the examples I will address, underscoring the importance of cultural safety in supporting migrant women of colour. Dotson's insights are not finished there. Two further points relate to the testimonial quieting and smothering. And this is about audiences. So audiences who exhibit testimonial competence or incompetence. And the speaker may either determine an audience is able to find her testimony intelligible, or the speaker may see that the audience fails to find her testimony intelligible. Testimonial competence or incompetence does not depend, this is a really important point, on whether someone has the background knowledge or not. It is about understanding and sensitivity to the lack of background knowledge. So actually acknowledging that you don't know, but I'm hearing you and I'm trying to understand. I don't know. But Dotson's insights are not finished. Where am I? Sorry, I've lost my place. Dotson's example here is too relevant to gloss over. Drawing on Cassandra Byers-Harvin's article describing race conversations in the US, a glaring example of testimonial incompetence is in this following excerpt, where Harvin had an encounter in a public library with a white woman, early 50s looking, who asks Harvin what she's working on. Harvin responds by indicating she's researching raising black sons in this society, and the white woman promptly asks, how is that different from raising white sons? In this example of testimonial incompetence, the injuries of black parenthood are ignored, bracketed out, and erased. The white questioner is centred in the question asked. Here, as Morton Robinson, referring specifically to white women academics and feminists, says race remains extraneous to whites and its relevance and meaning is depoliticized for those positioned as other. So it's not understood as a political identity for those positioned as other, and, you know, they are positioning themselves as neutral. A couple of further concepts illustrate what's happening here. Kevin Richardson, in a study of inequities and injustices against trans people, outlines the differences between exclusion and erasure. Richardson says while the wrongs of exclusion and erasure overlap, they are not the same. Erasure, unlike exclusion, obscures marginalised identities from public view. When an identity is erased, the individuals that inhabit that identity are rendered invisible to the policies and formal practices of the institution that erases them. And this can be worse than exclusion. Some social identities are recognised only to be excluded. Other social identities are often not even excluded. In the latter case, social groups and institutions do not have determinate conclusions about individuals with these identities because policymakers do not imagine the possibility of such people. So who or what is erased? Erasure might apply to racialised religious identities that are not recognised by laws as being racialised, such as Muslims, for example. Erasure also describes with some accuracy what we are seeing in the relative institutional silence around the brutality on Palestinian people and women. Though the plight of Palestinian women is something happening over there rather than here, there is an important parallel for women that are neither necessarily considered of colour or white. Institutions don't know how to talk about these women. The idea of erasure relates not just to the suffering of women who may fall through visible racial cracks, but also when failing to recognise core components of some migrant women's identities and experiences as built around family and community without letting stereotypes control the narrative. Identities built around family might especially be the case for women from the global south who have not been socialised in neoliberal societies that emphasise individualism. For migrant women of colour who have suffered the gendered pains of emigration and leaving families behind, the families and communities they form as immigrants can be sacrosanct. Family can be a site of love, violence, duty, or perhaps for some others the only port in a storm of isolation in living in a strange, inhospitable place. As Stanley Fish observes in his Insights on Boutique Multiculturalism, deeply embedded parts of some cultural frameworks cannot simply be bracketed out. In relation to families in the Great Lakes Project, a participant in the women's focus group situated family as a site of support. The lifestyle here is different where back home in Africa we have grandmum, auntie living with you at home and helping to take care of kids no matter how the husband is a drunkard. But you are only two on your own here with difficult lifestyle that requires to support each other. In the migration context, another woman said, talking about a husband's behaviour to external people out of the family is an unforgivable sin. And, I want to emphasise that there were differing insights in those communities. I don't want to homogenise that, but this was a recurring theme. In contrast, Amani Haydar, a Muslim Lebanese woman, decided to refuse testimonial smothering, speak of the violence that occurred within her family. She had no choice because it was a high-profile case. Her experience upon sharing her story is a demonstration of testimonial incompetence stemming from pernicious ignorance. I had only recently changed my Twitter profile picture to one of me in a hijab and had never mentioned my trauma there before. I'd forgotten that my appearance would affect my right to participate in conversations on gender-based violence. How could I have forgotten people so accustomed to correlating Muslims with violence that I wasn't allowed the compassion that might be extended to other victims? I wasn't even allowed an opinion about my own mother's death. Pernicious ignorance, if it doesn't lead to testimonial smothering, can lead to a presentation of the self that mitigates risky testimony. Haidar recounts her experience at the police station when her mother was killed by her father. We'll be getting a statement from you and anyone else who might know what's happened, explained the police officer. Sure, I'm happy to help. I smiled the way you do when you want to show someone you're not the enemy. Was she already judging us? What assumptions had they already made about my family? Mum and Dad always said not to tell people outside the house our personal business, but I was sitting in front of a stranger and she was raking through my parents' relationship. Aside from her suspicion at the police station and aside from the online trolls who said nasty racist things online, she is disillusioned with institutions and their racially inflected responses to the gravity of her mother's murder. When Haidar's father applied for a judge-only trial, it was refused by the judge, who said a jury trial would allow the court to consider the role and place of domestic violence in our society and the role and place of cultural views with respect to the relationship between people born into the cultures different to our own. Justice Garling pointed to the disharmony which arises in some cases between the norms of traditional practicing Muslims and the norms of the majority non-Muslims in this community. Again, violence is their problem. We don't engage in violence. We're here to help you. Legal system let her down by subscribing to the very stereotypes that she found abhorrent. It's also an instance of white benevolence. We need to understand their barbarism as against our norms. We're helping by centering whiteness as an uninterrogated norm while questioning their difference as the source of extreme domestic violence. There is no cultural safety in that approach. But she did find the trauma support services very helpful. A godsend, in fact. Amani Haydar's experience was extreme. She was dealing with the trauma of a mother murdered by her father and speaks of having to work through that trauma. In contrast, Haydar's sentiments about counselling were not necessarily reflected in the Great Lakes community, nor is counselling and a generally individualist approach seen as a gold standard amongst other groups who are subject to the pains of genocide in their homelands and being apart from their families on top of that. The Great Lakes Women's Folks Group had to say this about support services and concerns around culturally and structurally experienced communities being lost in translation. Speaker one, when people seek help, we get social workers from Australian backgrounds. They don't understand exactly what I'm trying to tell them. You know, if you come out saying all this, then they will be like, oh, there's an organisation that will help you. But still that organisation will not understand what I'm telling them. Australian organisations, they want to assume we understand you. They help you in their culture and you feel that you are not helped. Also, someone else said, and this is a striking example, person expresses emotion in native language. And compounding this reluctance around testimonial incompetence, there is cultural codes of shame. What will people say if I leave my husband? Within the communities, and mistrust of the authorities due to being from war-torn countries with broken institutions. Most of the communities fear the blue uniform, who might take children away and split the family. We come from a background which is so family-oriented. You want to raise your kids, your house with a male figure in your life, and then you've heard that the system will take you and the kids away fast as they are dealing with you. Some people can't live for the possibility of taking my child away. Coming back to the earlier point, family in the context of migration is sacrosanct. In African Great Lakes communities, extended family prevents DV through those practices that I was talking about. Thank you. And I will ask you. And deals with it in the communal fashion without involving others, without subjecting those women to shame. It is not an individualized approach or problem or responsibility. All right, so I come to the end. Boy, I'm sweating. Yeah. So where do we go from here? So examples include of best practice domestically and internationally include Full Stop Australia and a project that I'm involved in called the Social Responders Project. Full Stop, people, if you're online, hello and thank you for coming. I don't know if you are, but thanks if you are, and shout out to you. Also, I have met a wonderful woman from a gender advisor from the United Nations mission in South Sudan. Hasumi, if you're online, shout out to you as well, who filled me in about referral networks for gender-based violence in the UNMISS mission in South Sudan. So UNMISS utilises what is a referral network. Sorry, hang on. I'll go back actually. I'll talk about the local context first. So the Social Responders Project is one where uh, Full Stop Australia is engaging focus groups amongst migrant women from different communities and asking them what they want and how they can actually respond to violence within their communities. Great Lakes, Glappard has also done this within their own communities, and that was what that research was about. And the United Nations mission, going to an international example now, and I'm speaking really fast because I'm about to run out of time, and I want to leave some room for questions. UNMISS utilises internal networks, including local women, local NGOs, child protection advisors, women protection advisors and gender advisors to address specific protection concerns around conflict and gender violence. So these specialists provide expertise and guidance in responding to issues like sexual violence, which is rife at the moment in South Sudan, and gender-based violence and child protection. And military components are involved in this, but to provide protection from women who need to be removed from particular contexts where they will be subject to sexual violence. I do want to end with saying silencing exists within communities as well, sometimes more than it exists in white institutions, but the silencing comes from somewhere different, not testimonial incompetence. Um, Amani Haydar and the Great Lakes women had something to say about that, where Amani Haydar actually admonishes her community for hiding these things. And the women in the Great Lakes women's focus groups also said that we need to build trust between us because we don't have our families here to intervene. So in this case, women need somewhere to go. Community can be like family, a site of love and of abuse, where women may be understood, but they may be judged. Of course, changes need to be made within those communities, but in the meantime, white institutions need to think about how to listen and hear without cultural assumptions. They need to provide havens of cultural safety, working with and centering those women in communities with respect to their lived experience and listening to what they say and what they need. Of course, intervention might be needed, but that intervention will look different depending on cultural circumstances. Sometimes counselling and wellbeing initiatives don't cut it. It isn't enough. They seem empty or stingy, as the characters of a wonderful book by a Turkish author I read called The Anthropologist put it. Cultural safety and intersectional anti-racist practice are critical approaches in creating inclusive and equitable institutional environments, particularly in healthcare, law, education and social services, and in other institutional environments that grapple with gender violence in conflict. Cultural safety emphasizes recognizing and addressing power imbalances, respecting the complexity of cultural identities and their relationships, and ensuring that individuals feel safe and respected in all interactions. Don't make cultural assumptions is my takeaway message. Cultural safety also comes out of not assuming that just because someone is from a certain migrant background that they are subject to violence. This happens a fair bit, and I've heard some awful examples of it coming out of some medical practitioners. I'll skim over what I was supposed to say, but I will end with something that my mum used to say that was positive. Um, she said something along the lines of, I'm so glad we brought the kids here and that you were born here. We bought a house, you all had an education, we had great healthcare, and you were protected. Australians are compassionate people. And I'll end there.
If anyone in the room has any questions or comments that they'd like to share, just raise your hand and I'll bring the roving mic around.
I don't know what to say, but it's so touching to see someone dedicating their life to such issues. as someone from the region, of your research focus, I come from the eastern part of the DRC, where I was born and grew up and experienced many of the things that probably most of you have heard about at the border between Rwanda and Congo. We share a lot of cultural, I would say similarities. We've got a lot of similarities.
Yeah.
And a number of things, as you have very beautifully pointed out in your presentation, when you talked about them, because I previously worked in SGBV before coming here, I worked as SGBV Survivors Transition Officer with an Italian organization, then worked as a Gender Research Associate. And as you beautifully said, some of the ways that such issues would be addressed here might never be possible unless, those structures which are offering interventions understand how some cultural values or cultural, how can I say, or cultural assets, could be tapped into for addressing whatever issues there might be. Because like you've said, in a family, a marriage is not just between two individuals in that region.
Yeah.
It involves the whole community, the extended family. And sometimes a male might feel a bit of shame, to inflict anything upon their wife, because they know that's causing shame not just to himself, but to the parents, and that the parents would be looked upon as a failure. And that, in a sense, prevents, least be it, it's not really perhaps as the most efficient way, but at least as there are those kind of cultural beliefs or cultural ways of viewing, which to some extent make the men accountable to a larger number of people than just the woman.
Yes.
It reduces the intensity of domestic violence. And of course, there are other things like, for example, when we don't understand that a man in a household has that kind of view that I have to provide for my wife, but upon they get here, they cannot earn a coin to support their family.
Yeah.
They feel disempowered. They feel useless.
Yeah.
And that there is a big trauma on their mind because they feel like their being has been reduced to nothing.
Yeah.
And that this in and of itself could generate a lot of, things that could result into violences, maybe because they can no longer cope with the stress or the pressure. Sometimes not necessarily that because the woman is demanding or requesting many things, but there is that kind of sense of ego, I would call it, that you're not a man if you don't provide for your family. If you don't have an income regularly that, your wife or your children could need something and you provide for them.
Yes.
So all of these things, when these people have been resettled here, unless we have people who are, conducting such research like you're doing and, revealing such, truths and realities, I think it would be a problem that will never be, resolved or addressed. But thank you for such findings. I feel honored to hear, you talking about these things, about my culture and the issues that my people are facing here. And I strongly believe that such research, if taken seriously, could help this country. In my own classes, when I teach students, I got a couple of courses as in casual academic. I always stress this. We're a beautiful country. We have got a lot of potentials. We have got, I think we would be diplomatically the most powerful country in the world if we can explore all those potentials.
Yeah.
We have got people with different cultures that we could probably explore for whatever diplomatic purposes we want.
Yeah.
But these cultures that we have here, that we have accepted to bring here as part of our multicultural communities, what are the values that they have within them that we could explore? Because some of the experiences that these migrant communities have shared with you could probably inspire some other community outside. And wouldn't that be some sort of pride or source of pride if something that you have worked on or found out like a way to address these issues could be used elsewhere. For me, as an aspiring academic, I always find like there is a sort of pride in that. If the research you're conducting here can inspire other people outside, because we've got specific cases that probably not every other country can have, and that this such a big issue as DV, if we can think of ways to address this by taking into account different cultural perspectives, I think the world would learn so much from us.
Yeah.
Again, I thank you so much for this insightful paper, and I'd love to have a copy for myself if that's possible, so I can read and reread it again. Thank you.
No problems. Thank you so much. That was so effusive. Thank you. Thank you for, what is that cultural practice? Is it Kua? No, maybe it wasn't from DRC. It's all right. I'll send you the paper. Yeah.
That's so beautiful, and it's one of the reasons why the Thought Leadership series exists, making our academics' research tangible and accessible for a wide range of people, not just the academic sphere. Okay, anyone with anything to add in the room? Okay, we might go to online. I will hand over to Anthony, who will read out the online questions. We had 59 people online.
Thanks, Emma. So Dr. Dagistanli got a couple of questions and a few comments. The first one's from Jeff Suquist. He asks, how can we make our organisation anti-racist?
Well, I think, okay, which organisation is that? It depends on the organisation. But what you can do across organisations is actually centre the experiences of the people that are, having, marginalisation inflicted on them, and take a look at yourself. So that's how you make an organisation anti-racist, I think. You need to take a look at yourself, sit back and say, we don't have all the answers for all these different groups who have different experience to the one that I've got. So you need to be self-reflexive, need to listen and centre the voices of others. I think that is the first step to making an organisation anti-racist. That's a brief response, and I hope it's answered your question, but I really think it's quite simple. These voices need to be foregrounded and heard in the ways that they need to be heard, rather than just thinking that we've got all the answers. I'll stop there.
There are a couple of comments following on from that. So Dr. Karamakoska said, I think this nation is still trying to figure that one out too. We got from Shika, we can't until inclusiveness remains a choice, not a mandatory obligation. You've got a lot of thanks from audience members. So from Santina Bertone, thanks so much for giving us a language to describe so many nuanced forms of gendered violence, exclusion and silencing used against women of colour. The terms are very powerful and useful when focusing the mind on these common everyday forms and why they are damaging. From Shima, great talk. Thanks so much, Selda. Thanks so much for an insightful presentation, Doctor. Dr. Karamakoska, thank you so much for sharing these insights and articulating the experiences many of us have been facing here. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for inviting us into this uncomfortable conversation. What a well-articulated exposition. Thank you, Selda. Thank you for an honest and insightful presentation. Thank you, Selda, and a fantastic and thought-provoking talk from New Zealand. Thank you so much, Selda. This has been most insightful. Thank you, Dr. Dagistanli. Great to see the quotes that have got implications for support services as well. Thank you so much, Selda, for this wonderful presentation. Lots of effusive praise for your talk.
Oh, thank you. That's really lovely. Was there any, were there any best practice suggestions from the online audience? Or because I'd be interested to know.
No more that I can see here.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, I'd like to join also our online audience in just thanking you today, and thank you so much, Selda.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for coming.